Just to go through the running order for today, we're going to hear from JACU, the Joint Air Quality Unit, who are going to give us a national perspective, and then followed by Transport for London, who are going to be talking about the ULEZ. So they're a couple of months into the ULEZ, so they're going to talk about some of the learning so far and also some of the next steps. We'll then hear from Transport for Greater Manchester, who are just at the start of consulting on their clean air plans. So they will talk through some of the proposals. And then finally, we'll give a bit of an update from the BVRLA in terms of some of the work that we've been doing in terms of engagement and some of the resources that are available to members on our website. And then we'll have a Q&A at the end as well. So if you do have questions throughout the presentations, if you can just type them in, and then at the end we will have a Q&A session where we'll pick out some of those questions that have been posed. Hopefully we have Tina from JACU. So just our speakers for today, we've got Tina Blansford from the Joint Air Quality Unit. Then we have Laura Dayett, who's the Project Manager at Transport for London, and then Megan Black for Transport for Greater Manchester. So I'd like to thank all of our speakers for today. Laura, are you able to speak?
Hi, it's Laura here. So yeah, thanks for having me today, and hopefully I can tell you something useful and interesting about our proposals and what we're currently doing in London. So you probably all have heard of the ultra low emission zone. It's an area within which vehicles have to meet a specific emission standard. So the vehicle doesn't meet the standard, the owner is required to pay a charge to drive within the zone. So it launched back in April, on the 8th of April, and it initially covers the same area as a congestion charge zone in central London, which if someone could turn a slide for me, you can see the zone. So it's operational 24/7, 365 days a year, unlike the congestion charge, which is only operational part of the day. So the standards apply to almost all vehicles, so there are very few exceptions to the zone, and the emission standards vary by vehicle type and by whether it's a petrol or diesel vehicle. So if you can switch over to the next slide, you can see the standards. So for motorcycles, it's Euro 3 standard for both petrol and diesel vehicles. For cars, vans and minibuses, it's Euro 4 for petrol and Euro 6 for diesel. And for larger vehicles, such as lorries and coaches, it's Euro 6 for both petrol and diesel. Now, if the vehicle doesn't meet the standard, the owner wants to drive in the zone, then they have to pay a charge, which is £12.50 per day for smaller vehicles and £100 for larger vehicles. The ULEZ replaces the previous emissions surcharge, also called the T-charge, that came in February 2017, so that's gone now. And it's an additional charge to the congestion charge. So if vehicles are travelling into the zone in congestion charging hours, 7 AM to 6 PM, Monday to Friday, they also have to pay the congestion charge. It's also in addition to the low emission zone. So for larger vehicles, HGVs, coaches and buses, travelling within Greater London, they also have to pay the low emission zone charge, which has been in place for many years now. So you may think, why are we doing this? It's quite a stringent measure. Well, road transport accounts for half of nitrogen oxide emissions in Greater London, with diesels being the largest contributor. Our toxic air is stunting the growth of children's lungs in ways which will affect them for the rest of their lives. It causes cancer, increases the risk of asthma, stroke and dementia. There are 2 million Londoners living in areas with exceeding legal limits. So 400,000 children under the age of 18 live in areas exceeding legal limits. And thousands of Londoners die prematurely every year from toxic air pollution, so there's a real need to address this issue. Not only in terms of health, but also it can cost up to £3.7 billion per year annually to a society. And we expect that the ULEZ will reduce nitrogen oxide emissions by up to 45% in central London. So what should you do, or what should your customers do? You can use our online vehicle checker, which if you skip to the next slide, you can see a link to that. Oh, 2 slides, there we go. So the vehicle checker we have online, we can type in your vehicle registration number, your license plate number, and it will tell you whether your vehicle complies with our standards or not. Generally, petrol vehicles registered after 2005 are compliant, and diesel vehicles after September 2015. So if you've got a vehicle that's newer than that, then you should be fine. If your vehicle doesn't comply, then you can obviously pay the charge. So if you can't meet the standards, then you can also replace the vehicle with one that complies. So we have 2 schemes that can help people to do this. We currently have a van scrappage scheme. This is available for micro businesses with 10 or fewer employees, or sole traders, or people with charity minibuses. They can scrap up to 3 vehicles, and there are 3 options. The first option is to get a contribution of $3,500 per vehicle for scrapping a vehicle that regularly enters the ULEZ. There's another option to have $3,500 for scrapping a vehicle and replacing it with a Euro 6 compliant vehicle, either through purchase, leasing, or long-term hire. And then there's a £6,000 per vehicle grant for scrapping a vehicle and replacing it with an electric vehicle. There's lots more information on our website about this on the link that you can see on the presentation. And then later this year, we're announcing plans for a low-income household scrappage scheme. The details of this being worked out at the moment, but you'll find out about that later in the year. So in terms of what's happened so far with the scheme, it's obviously very new, so it's quite hard to determine the full impact of the ULEZ on air quality. But what we do know that in the first month, there was 74% of vehicles were complying with the standards, which is a huge increase from 39% in February 2017. There are around 9,400 fewer older or more polluting vehicles in the zone on an average day, so that's a reduction of over a quarter. And since February 2017, when the T-charge was introduced as a precursor to the ULEZ, there's been a 20% reduction in nitrogen dioxide concentrations at roadside monitoring sites in the zone. So we are seeing some very positive signs at the moment. And then in the future, you'll see actually on the slide that's just been shown, there are future plans to change the scheme. So from the 26th of October 2020, the low emission zone, which applies to the whole of London, will be tightened so that if you're driving a HGV, a coach and a bus, you have to meet the Euro 6 standards. And if you don't meet the standards, you'll need to pay £100 or £300 if you don't also meet Euro 4 standards. That applies only to HGVs, coaches and buses. The vans and minibuses are unaffected. And then from 2021, 26th of October, if you change over the slide for me, then the ULEZ zone is expanding into inner London, so all the way up to North and South Circular roads, not including the North and South Circular. So this will still apply to the same vehicles, motorcycles, cars, vans and minibuses. The HGVs and coaches will be covered by the low emission zone instead, and same standards and same charges as central London. So that's where we're going to be come 2021. So hopefully that's given you a good overview of where the scheme is at the moment and where it's going in the future. But if you'd like to know anything else, please do ask some questions.
Thanks, Laura. If anyone has got any questions, if you want to type them in the box, and then we can pose these to Laura at the end of the session. Okay, so I'm Catherine Bowen. I'm the Senior Policy Advisor leading on air quality at the BVRLA. So the BVRLA members have are responsible for over 5 million vehicles on the UK's roads and purchase around 50% of new vehicles sold annually in the UK. Also 1.4 million cars. That includes a third of new electric and hybrid vehicles. And on this table here, when we look at our sustainability credentials, due to the fleet cycles of our members, we also operate the cleanest and greenest vehicles, so therefore we'll be compliant in a number of the clean air zones. So that's on this slide here. And then there's another one for the commercial vehicle fleet as well. It's worth pointing out that these are actually over a year old now, so the credentials are likely to be even better. And when you look at the average age of our vehicles, the credentials, our members are also responsible for helping to feed the second-hand market. So 1 in 5 vehicles are sold on to the second-hand market. So this really shows how our sector can really help to increase the uptake of cleaner and greener vehicles that are going to be compliant with a number of the clean air zones. So when we look at some of the points that we've raised in discussion with local authorities and looking at the sustainability credentials, some of the main issues that we face are that, particularly with the commercial vehicles, there does tend to be an insufficient Euro 6 stock of lorries that meet the demand. So this can therefore be very expensive when we're looking at retrofit options, so it's just not viable. We're also keen to point out in discussion with local authorities that trucks aren't the only source of NOx. So there are other vehicles, and actually when you look at a medium-sized truck, it's actually carrying the load of 10 vans, and a larger lorry can actually carry the load of 20. So when we're looking at the penalties involved with clean air zones, actually, I think there's a wider point in terms of how we can help with congestion as well. We also recognise that there are currently no approved retrofit options for HGVs, as I mentioned earlier, and also because of fleet cycles with HGVs, and they tend to be used for sort of 12 years, upgrading outside of the normal fleet cycle is therefore very expensive. So this is something that we've raised in a number of the consultation responses that we've put forward. I guess also when we're looking at alternative fuels, these aren't affordable or scalable at this present moment in time. So one of the other points we've been very keen to raise with local authorities, but also in our engagement with JACU, is that we really need consistency. So, particularly when we do look at those that are charging HGVs, it can be quite confusing in terms of the amounts that are being asked for, and there's no consistency. So that's something else that we are working on in liaison. Many SMEs as well are operating on very tight margins and will be unable to upgrade their fleets in time. So when we look at a particular case study, looking at one of our members where they were supplying vehicles to a medium-sized commercial vehicle rental company, looking at this particular profile, it was a company that employed 54 employees with a turnover of 13 million and a profit of just 1.2 million per annum. The fleet size was 1,200, and when you looked at the number of vans and trucks that were compliant and the upgrade cost, they were actually looking at a total of £23 million. So between now and the introduction of some of the clean air zones, this is obviously, going to be very difficult to upgrade with those costs in such a short space of time. There's also the write-downs as well. So when you look at the fact that, it's going to be very difficult to get rid of some of these, the stock that is not going to be compliant, then we need to take that into consideration as well. And one of the things that we're asking for is phase charging so that, there is still a viable second-hand market. When we look at the way forward, one of the things that we've asked for is that local authorities use clean air zones as a sort of last resort, and that they've looked at a number of appropriate mitigation measures. So there are a number of areas which have used mitigation in replace of a charging clean air zone. So we're very keen that this is a last resort. We're also looking at, options where road space can be used a lot smarter, and also where there's locally based exemptions, particularly where there's depots that may be just on the border, and so people are just going to skirt in and out of the clean air zone. It's very important there are some exemptions for these companies. I mentioned before about phase charging, and that's really important to us because we want to ensure that there is still a viable second-hand market for some of these vehicles. And as I mentioned before, there are no retrofit options. It's very expensive looking at retrofit, so this needs to be taken into consideration. And we also need to make sure that there are consistencies across the clean air zones. And I'm sure when we hear from JACU, they'll talk about some of the work they're doing nationally. So another case study in terms of the value that I think the fleet and rental sector has to play. There was a family business, Lodge Tyres, who is the biggest independent commercial company in the country and has depots throughout the Midlands and the northwest of England, so therefore was going to be impacted by the introduction of some of the clean air zones. So to support its operation, it runs a fleet of 280 vans and 20 cars. So they worked with Pendragon Vehicle Management to look at their existing fleet's mileage and the number of trips that they were making. And the conclusion from that was that the Renault Kangoo would be the best appropriate van for them. So leasing the vans instead of buying outright has meant that this business didn't need to make that huge upfront investment. and leasing the electric van resulted in an increase of £40 per month compared with a diesel van. So although this will be offset by 20 grand fuel and tax savings from going electric. So one of the things that we've been keen to stress is that where companies are, looking at their fleets and they are going to be non-compliant, that rental and leasing is an option that is being put forward to them to help with the costs. So that's a good case study of how, the sector can help and the ways that we can look to promote that. And I know in discussion with JACU, when they do talk about the vehicle checker, one of the things they are looking is then signposting to the BVRLA website. So in terms of the resources that we have available, we've on our website there is a clean air zones map. So you can look at all of the different areas and it breaks down into further detail where there are charging clean air zones. It will also link through to those local authorities so that you can get more information as to what their plans are and the likely launch times. And we've had some really positive feedback to this because it's almost like a one-stop shop where people can look at what different local authorities are doing across the country. So whilst we do continue to work with the local authorities on an individual basis, but also with the Joint Air Quality Unit, this is a place where members can go to see what the latest plans are. We're also advertising when different local authorities are consulting. We ourselves will consult, but we'll also make sure that members have the opportunity to put their views forward as well. And then when we look at some of the other BVRLA resources, we have a number of fact sheets on the website as well. So we have a fleet air quality fact sheet, there's a clean air zones and HGVs fact sheet, and there's also the London ULEZ fact sheet that we recently pulled together when the ULEZ came to fruition. And we'll be looking at doing similar when some of the other local authorities' clean air zones come into being. I'd also just like to mention our Future of Mobility Congress that we have running on the 4th of July. So at that event, we'll be launching a report which is looking at the role of the car in the city. So when we're looking at urban planning and future mobility, we want to make sure that the car is still seen as having a place. So the report will be launched at that event. We've also got a clean air zone session. So as part of the main presentations, there'll be a clean air zone session, but also during the break times, there'll also be a clean air zone advice zone. So a number of the local authorities and JACU will be there to take any questions from people who are at the event. There's also a session running on the last mile. So we're looking at, particularly when we do talk about some of the issues with HGVs and last mile deliveries, how some of the fleet operators are overcoming some of those issues and working with our members to make sure that they're in a good place with that. And there's also a session on electric vehicles and electric dreams. Okay, so I think we now have Tina.
So thank you everybody and good afternoon. My name is Tina Blanford and I work in the Joint Air Quality Unit, which is, for those of you who don't know, is a joint Department for Transport and Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs unit, which has been set up to tackle exceedances in NO2. Let me get down. Okay, yes, it is working. Right. Why are we doing this? So we know that air pollution is the largest environmental health risk in the UK, and we know that long-term exposure to air pollution reduces life expectancy by increasing deaths from lung, heart and circulatory conditions. And it also exacerbates conditions such as asthma, bronchitis, chronic heart disease and stroke. We also know that air pollution most severely affects vulnerable groups. So, for example, the elderly, children, and people already suffering from pre-existing health conditions. Moving on. So why are we implementing clean air zones? So air quality is improving, but the government's most immediate air quality challenge is to reduce concentrations of NO2 around roads where the levels are above legal limits. And so the concept of clean air zones was first set out in a 2015 UK NO2 plan as a key tenet to tackling NO2 concentrations at the roadside. There is a set of minimum requirements for clean air zones, which includes being a delineated geographical area and can cover a range of measures to improve air quality. And then an optional requirement is that they can include a charging access restriction element, which is using existing Transport Act 2000 powers, and hence that is a charging clean air zone there. So the charge is intended to improve air quality by driving behaviour change for cleaner journeys, through changing the fleet composition and increasing the number of sustainable journeys. And so they're not designed to be revenue raisers or congestion charges, and any excess profit generated is then used for local transport measures. So JACU is working with 61 local authorities that have an NO2 exceedance, and of those, 37 have been identified as having persistent exceedances, which are exceedances over 3 years. And those local authorities have been required to draw up a plan to address their exceedances in the shortest possible time and possibly consider a charging clean air zone, although other non-charging measures are preferred if they are at least as effective. So what is a charging clean air zone? So the charging clean air zones, there's a framework which sets out the parameters to provide national consistency on who is affected, but the charges are set locally by the individual local authority. There's 4 different classes of charging clean air zones. So the first one is a Class A, which would affect buses, coaches, taxis, and ThVs. And it then ranges down to D, which is probably the strongest class, and that would also include HGVs, vans, minibuses, and cars. And so for each vehicle type, there's minimum emission standards for operating within the clean air zones, and they are defined as being Euro 6s for buses, coaches, and HGVs, a Euro 6 diesel, and a Euro 4 petrol for vans, minibuses, taxis, CHVs, and cars, and a Euro 3 for motorcycles. And then there may be exemptions that apply to this charging clean air zone. So there are national exemptions, which are things such as ultra-low emission vehicles or vehicles retrofitted to the emission standard or disabled tax class vehicles. But then in addition to those national exemptions, there could also be locally designed exemptions, which are down to that particular local authority's discretion. And so on the right-hand side of this slide, you also have the clean air zone road sign. So that is what that looks like. Right, so moving on. So this is just an overview of which local authorities are taking action, and they're sort of separated into different waves. So obviously the first wave are more advanced, and then followed by a second and third wave. And so as I just stated, there's 61 local authorities that have been required to assess what action is needed. And that has been supported by a fund of $495 million to develop and implement required measures. And there's also a $220 million Clean Air Fund, which is to help mitigate the impact of those plans on individuals and businesses. So 37 local authorities have been required to develop the local plan. And that means looking at what measures are necessary to achieve compliance in the shortest possible time. And so when the local authorities have pulled together a local plan using robust evidence, and JACU provides an account manager, economist, and scientific support in drawing up those plans, we then assess the local plans to make sure they're effective, good value, and deliver the required improvements in air quality in the shortest possible time. And if they don't meet that test, then the councils are required to take further action to achieve this legal compliance. So moving on to when and how many charging clean air zones will there be. So as I said, charging clean air zones are necessary in some areas to reduce roadside NO2 levels. And the government has received final plans from Birmingham, Leeds, Bath and North East Somerset, Sheffield and Rotherham and Coventry. And from that table, it sets out what has either been agreed, what class of charging clean air zone has been agreed, or what is being considered. And that is all publicly available information. And then obviously there is the third wave of local authorities where things are slightly less advanced, but we are still expecting there could be possible charging clean air zones, and they will come in early 2022. But we're expecting the first one to be in Birmingham and Leeds in 2020. And so moving on, this is just a brief slide on the infrastructure. So there will be traffic signs, and that is what it looks like, which will highlight when a vehicle is driving through a CAZ. So drivers will always know when they are entering or are already in a charging clean air zone and what types of vehicles are affected. And this sign is based on quite extensive research. Then there's also local authorities will be using ANPR cameras to capture vehicles entering the zone to ensure compliance. And there has been some guidance and certification provided to help local authorities with this. And then in addition, there is also the digital delivery side of charging clean air zones. So that comprises of three main core work streams. The first one is the centralised taxi and PHC database. That's a database of all taxi and PHC data that's currently held by each of the licensing authorities. There will also be a vehicle checker, which is an online tool that will allow motorists to enter their vehicle registration mark, determine whether or not they will incur a charge. And finally, there's a payment, settlement and reconciliation centralised payment portal where motorists will be able to pay any charges for entering a clean air zone. And this will be built on the gov.pay functionality. And so work is underway to develop those key components. Our priority is to introduce a reliable and consistent service as soon as possible, and that includes ensuring that robust testing is undertaken to get the system right. And then finally, communications update. So we are working to provide communications that will support local authorities with their local communications. One of the things that we have done already is the first iteration of a communications toolkit, which includes key messages, FAQs, useful stats and infographics, which will help ensure consistent messaging is put out for the general public to ensure there is a good understanding of what charging clean air zones entail. A second iteration is planned, and that will tie into national level communications, and will focus more on the charging arrangements, such as the online vehicle checker and the payment portal. We're also working with an external communications agency to develop national level communications, and that will be about making sure everybody knows where those charging clean air zones will be, and if they are drivers and affected by those charging clean air zones, what action they need to take. So it's all about building awareness, so businesses and drivers are aware of what is happening, and if they're affected, where they can pay any charges. And it's also ultimately about encouraging behaviour change, so which will lead to alternative cleaner transport options being considered, and which is the ultimate goal in achieving our NO2 plan targets. So I think that's probably enough from me for now, but if you have any questions, do let me know. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Tina. So we're just going to flick on to Megan's slide. Megan, can you hear us? Can we hear you?
Okay, so thank you very much. Apologies for the technical difficulties. Let's hope it doesn't go wrong again. So I'm Megan Black from Transport for Greater Manchester, and I'm sorry, I've got a bit of feedback, so if I just try that. Yeah, that's a bit better, sorry. So I'm here today to talk you through the plans that Greater Manchester have got with regards to improving air quality. Transport for Greater Manchester, on behalf of the 10 authorities across the region, are coordinating the feasibility study that we've pulled together. So if you could move forward. So just a little bit in terms of the air pollution across Greater Manchester. I think colleagues have already really covered ahead of me the issues that we've got. If you could just move my slides forward. But I think the one thing to be able to say is that in terms of Greater Manchester, it contributes to the equivalent of 1,200 deaths each year. And we've got many roads in our region which have got the harmful levels of nitrogen dioxide, and like has just been said by colleagues from JACU, the government have instructed us to take action to reduce those as soon as we can. So we've worked together to develop a clean air plan to tackle that issue. The following slides will just sort of we are in the middle of a conversation at the moment about these proposals, so what I really would encourage people to do is to go to the website that we've created for this plan, which is cleanairgm.com, because that contains a lot more information, and it also contains a link to a survey that we're currently running to understand what people think of the proposals, so we can make sure that we understand the impacts of them and mitigate them wherever we can. So in terms of what we're proposing, we've got a clean air zone across the whole of Greater Manchester to be introduced in 2 phases. The introduction of non-compliant buses, coaches, taxis, private hires and HGVs to pay what we're calling is a daily penalty, and in 2023 extending that to include non-compliant vans and minibuses. So essentially it's a CAZ category C that we're proposing to introduce. If we can move forward. As well as clean air zones, there's actually some funding to support local businesses to upgrade their vehicles to be cleaner, to meet the government's framework with regard to emission standards. And under the proposals we've got at the moment, we're looking to support taxis, private hires, HGVs, vans, minibuses, coaches and buses that are registered within Greater Manchester. We're also setting out that we would like to be able to treble the number of electric vehicle charging points that we've got in Greater Manchester, because clearly that will help people move to cleaner vehicles across the region. And we also want help in people being able to switch to greener transport, so more funding for our behaviour change team, which we call Sustainable Journeys here. So moving forward, in terms of the proposed daily penalty that we've got, we are setting out that there are different charges for different vehicles. 2021 it's £7.50 a day for taxis and private hire vehicles, and £100 for HGVs, buses and coaches. And then in 2023, with the extension to those different vehicle types, we're proposing £7.50 for those vehicles. And it's just been set out, if there was any surplus from that, it would be used to spend on improving transport in Greater Manchester. Now, we're clearly seeking views on the proposed daily penalties that are being suggested, and that's really why I'm going to keep going on about the conversation that we're having at the moment. We'd really like to hear back from people in terms of what. So moving forward, I've mentioned the funding that we're seeking to secure from the government. So in terms of HGVs, coaches, vans and minibuses, we're looking for £59 million to support what we're calling a clean freight fund. We're looking for £29 million to support a clean bus fund and £28 million to support a clean taxi fund. These are indicative funding amounts. They are subject to the government approving them, but they're also subject to further refinement. So it's really important that we hear from people on these proposals, because we are developing the eligibility and how people would be able to access them. We want to hear back from them so we can do that further and make sure that it meets people's needs. To sum up, we really would like people to join the conversation that we've been developing at the moment. The conversation is on until the 30th of June. The proposals will then be developed in some more detail over the coming months, informed by those responses, and ultimately we will have a statutory public consultation which will give people a further opportunity to have a say on the proposals once they've been developed into some more detail. Thank you.
Thank you, Megan. So we have a couple of questions, and if I start off with the ones that came in latest, which Megan, if I can pose these to you. So there's a question around will Manchester be increasing the charging points as treble will not be enough? And there's also a second question around if you live outside of Manchester, but if you're travelling in for things such as the football, I guess whether there's any sort of dispensations for things like that.
Sorry, will Manchester be increasing more than treble charging points as well as treble will be not enough? Well, that's the money that we're asking for in terms of the clean air proposals that we've got, but that doesn't mean that we're not going to increase the number of charging points that Greater Manchester's got. We've already got a charging network out there. We've got some early measures funding from the government to increase those numbers by a few. We're just going through a procurement process at the moment to secure ourselves a new supplier for that. And one of the things we want to do is to work with them to identify how we can expand it further and secure more investments. And then there was a question about are there any tools where registration numbers can be entered. For Greater Manchester, we do have a vehicle checker that we have pulled together. It doesn't relate back to BVRLA data. It does give you an indication of whether your vehicle would be chargeable under the scheme that we're proposing. But one of the things that we are looking forward to being able to promote to people is JACU's vehicle checker, which we understand will be coming online in the near future. And then I think somebody asked me a question about going to the football. Is that right? If they were coming in a car, then cars aren't part of the proposal that Greater Manchester has put forward. And we're proposing the category C, so that's everything, all non-compliant vehicles except for cars, unless they're a private hire vehicle, and motorcycles.
And then I'm just looking down, I think there's another few questions which, whether they're directed specifically at you, Megan, I would suggest probably not. So there's something around how will cities police people that are blocking charging points?
About policing charging points being blocked, I don't know the answer to that off the top of my head, but I can look into it. I mean, I'm guessing it's under the local authority's remit, but if there is any national advice on that or national line, then I can get back to you on that if that's okay.
And there's also a question about how about vehicles that are towing?
Yeah, I see that. Again, I would have to get back to you on that. I don't want to give you the wrong advice. So I can check with colleagues this afternoon and email you. That's okay. Presumably you'll be sending out the slides afterwards, so we could include advice with that. That's okay.
Okay. Thanks, Tina. And Manchester, is that something that you've considered?
In terms of vehicles being recovered?
Yeah, and if they're obstructing charging points and things like that, and how will that be policed or potentially penalised?
I think that's something that we need to take away and have a look at in terms of the ICE vehicles. In terms of the vehicles being recovered, one of the things we're doing as part of the conversation is to set out the exemptions that we are proposing, which, to be honest, are nothing more than is set out in the national framework. I was at a meeting the other day where somebody did recommend that we consider excluding or exempting recovery vehicles, because the last thing you want is a vehicle causing congestion that's broken down and being done. So that's something that we are looking at now.
Can I add in London? Hi. So in London, roadside recovery vehicles do have to pay the charge or be compliant, but if they're driving the broken down vehicle, then they'll be the one who has to pay the charge, not the broken down vehicle.
Thank you, Laura. So looking at some of the earlier questions, we had how many signs will there be in the CAZ areas, and will they only be outside the zone itself? So Tina, if you could maybe start with that one.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah. Okay, perfect. So signs, that will obviously depend on the size of the clean air zone, and it is obviously the local authority's responsibility, but we have got clean air zone signage guidance, and probably the main point to highlight there is that there will be clear signing at the point of entry into any charging clean air zone, and there will be signs in advance of entry to provide adequate information about potential charges applicable, and also to provide alternative routes to divert around it. And then also with regards to our national level comms, that is really about making sure people know where the clean air zone boundaries are, and that will include reaching out to those people and businesses that are from outside of that particular local authority. But as I stated just a moment ago, there is signage guidance that local authorities can adhere to.
Thanks, Tina. There's also a question around, so on this policing and sort of penalties, there's also a question around how we can deal with people that are pretending to charge. So I'm assuming they're almost getting a lead out and making it look like they're charging when they're not actually an EV. So is this something you've come across in London at all, Laura?
I'm not overly familiar with the electric vehicle kind of issue. I can ask my colleagues, but all local authorities would have powers on traffic orders to be able to control that. So it would just be a case of speaking to the enforcement teams to raise that issue with them, and they can be on the lookout for it.
Okay, thank you. And there's a question that's come in around commercial vehicles, and would the local authorities be offering accounts like TfL do? So, Megan, is that something that Manchester are considering?
Trying to say, I think that's really for colleagues from JACU to answer in terms of their providing the payment portal.
I think that's under consideration. I mean, it would be for local authorities to consider, but I can check that for you with the charging team.
Thank you. And then I've got, what are the plans for a zero emission in London, sort of post-2025? Laura, I think that's probably for you.
Yeah, so our Mayor's Transport Strategy has as a proposal 35, to introduce a clean zero emission zone in central London in 2025. That's still very much at the proposal stage. We're conducting kind of research and feasibility into that at the moment, so there are no firm plans yet, and when there are plans, we'll definitely consult on them well in advance to give people a chance to have their say.
Okay, thank you. And then there was also a question which I think was probably for us, which is, do we include minibuses in the van LCV analysis, or is it included in the car stats? And I'm going to hand over to my colleague Rachel to answer that one.
Yeah, I've just double-checked that, and the minibus stats that we run internally always go through our LCV. They're grouped in with that data.
Thanks, Rachel. And then a final question is, who is responsible for updating information on sat-navs and navigation providers? Tina, if I can maybe start with you on that one.
In London, TfL make the data available to third-party providers, so we just give the data to the providers like Waze, and they can update their apps. So I think Waze definitely do. I'm sure others do as well.
All right, lovely. And then Manchester, are you looking to do similar?
Well, we're still at the proposal stage, but if we do move forward with a clean air zone, then yeah, we would be making the information available to third parties to pick up and put into their apps.
Okay, great. Thank you. We've had quite a few questions about the slides. So yes, a copy of the slide deck will be circulated, and there'll also be a recording of the webinar on our website as well. And just wanted to conclude by again mentioning the Future Mobility Congress that we have on the 4th of July. And further details can be found on our website under the Events tab. So hopefully we can see some of you then. Thanks again to all of our speakers. Thank you, Tina, Laura, and Megan. And apologies for some of the technical difficulties to all of those of you listening in, but hopefully there was some useful information there and you were able to ask any questions that you wanted. Thanks all very much.
Thank you.